session. Our next area, Chris.
Thanks. Thank you, Minister. You've talked a lot about the importance of prevention. You've also talked a lot about the importance of increasing that supply of homes, and clearly the best way of ensuring that everyone has a home to live in is ensuring that we build enough homes for people to live in. But do you think, in your opinion, is there a link between the local housing allowance and homelessness prevention?
Is there a connection between
local housing allowance rates and homelessness prevention?
Well, look, we inherited a really challenging set of circumstances post-election, and the Chancellor announced a substantial increase in the funding that my department received on the homelessness agenda, bringing the total from additional 233 million, bringing the total to £1 billion. There's also, as you know, there are also other funding that has been made available across government into the public services that has been stretched over recent years. So that's the context in which we are operating. What we are doing in terms of looking at the longer term issues as part of the interministerial strategy is looking at some of the kind of broader policy challenges. So at the moment, some £32 billion goes into housing benefit costs, housing related costs. There are also other costs. So there needs to be really careful thinking about how we reduce those sorts of costs so that you could redirect investment in the things that are needed. But those are challenges that can't be addressed overnight. But we recognise the pressures and the costs to local authorities, and that's why obviously we've allocated the funding.
I think that's the key point as well, because as I alluded to in the first question, clearly a lot of the problems, the reason we're having to spend so much of this is that this country has not been building enough houses, and it's driven up the cost of housing. But if we accept that's true, and we also accept what you've just said, which is that that's not a problem that's going to be solved overnight, and for that extra supply of housing is going to take us quite some time, many years, in order to come online, is it not therefore going to cause a big problem for local housing allowance rates to be frozen as is currently planned for the next financial year?
Well, I don't think there's more to add beyond, we have a difficult inheritance. There's a £22 billion black hole that the Chancellor has had to address, this government has had to address. Public services are under massive pressure. We have invested over 25 billion in the healthcare system that was underfunded, and of course interventions in healthcare is important in terms of those groups that we're concerned about here who are facing rough sleeping and homelessness. So that's the context in which we are operating. What we are determined to do as a department is to do everything we can to alleviate the pressures, both in terms of longer term, as I say, supply, but also the action we're taking. So on rough sleeping, which we'll come on to, we've committed funding, increased funding, as well as on the homelessness prevention side.
Go on, you probably want to. Do you want to?
Just on that, Minister, obviously we know that the LHA rates are not set by MCHLG, but it's Department for Work and Pensions. Do you not feel that by maybe them not discussing or consulting with colleagues in MCHLG, they will be undoing all the good work that you are trying to do on this agenda?
Do you mind if I add to that as well? And you've got this task force for ending homelessness, which is going to be working cross department. So will that task force be looking into this alongside your colleagues in that other department? And in that strategy note that you discussed with us earlier, if you do look into it, will you release the findings of what you found after you've been looking into this?
Well, look, on your point about LHA and other policies, this is an internal government interdepartmental group which will publish a strategy. So that's the format. In terms of discussions we will be having with ministers across government, and that's why it's really important that DWP and other Treasury and other ministers are involved. And just to reassure you, there's a lot of goodwill and commitment across government on tackling this issue. So I very much hope that we will be looking at these issues carefully. But it's not in my gift to get beyond what was set out in the budget. But of course, we recognise that these are big challenges, and to meet those longer term challenges, we will need to look at these wider policy issues collectively as a government, and then identify what should happen. But in terms of, Chair, you mentioned the point about the good work being undone. I suppose what I would say is, at this stage of the government, we are very much focused. I mean, the way I'd frame it is we've got these immediate challenges that we need to address, and we've been very focused on making sure that... Which have been
exacerbated by the freeze in the LHA.
Sorry?
Would you agree that those challenges have been exacerbated by the freeze in the LHA rates?
Well, I think the challenges have been exacerbated by these long-term issues, the going back a decade or more. So we're not going to be able to resolve these issues immediately, not least because, there's a massive challenge around the financial environment that we've inherited. But that said, I think what's really encouraging is that there is additional funding that's been made available, recognising the fiscal climate. So what I would say is that we just got to be realistic about the fact that some of these changes will require us to look deeper into what those policy challenges are. In terms of the work in terms of wider resources that have been made available, of course, there are a number of funds that those who are facing homelessness and rough sleeping, those interventions, financial interventions, will be really important for. I mentioned domestic violence safe accommodation. There's also drugs and alcohol treatment funding in relation to those who are sleeping rough, where there's high prevalence of the need for that kind of support. There are a range of other funding streams that are critical to the support that people who are facing homelessness or rough sleeping require.
Okay. Just on the data, Penny, will your department continue to monitor the number of children in temporary accommodation as a result of the freeze on the LHA rates?
We collect we have a statutory data collection, the age data collection, and so that collects data on the number of households in temporary accommodation broken down by the number with children. So we'll continue to collect and publish that data.
Okay. Do you think that the number of children in temporary accommodation will increase as a result of that freeze?
I think there are lots of, as we've spoken about earlier, there are lots of factors that go into driving homelessness. It's a complex picture, and household incomes are one of those factors, but there are a number of things that affect household incomes. That's employment, wages, as well as welfare decisions. So I suppose it's an extremely complex set of drivers that drive sort of homelessness, both at a national level, but also lots of individual factors at an individual level. So it's very hard to isolate particular drivers.
Thank you. Just moving on to issue of rough sleeping, Sarah.
Thank you. And yeah, it would be good if you could lay out, Minister, the actions that you're taking to tackle rough sleeping and the rough sleeping emergency specifically, and not just to talk about this, but also to talk about the actions you'll be taking that aren't just about the kind of current emergency, but also about tackling this and ending this for good. Please.
Well, thank you very much. The first thing to say is the funding that we've allocated is 283.2 million in funding for 3 of our rough sleeping grants for 2025-26. Before Christmas, we announced £10 million for winter pressures, and yesterday I announced a further 20 million to support local authorities for rough sleeping winter pressures. So we recognise that this is a really challenging agenda. Again, the numbers have been rising, going in the wrong direction. We are determined to do what we can, everything we can, to support local areas. And I just want to say how grateful I am to local partners and the charities. The work they do particularly during the winter, but all year round, is phenomenal. And also those who fund them in the public, but also in the philanthropic sector. We've had the opportunity to see the work that they do across the country, and it's incredibly powerful. In terms of I mentioned the drug and alcohol treatment grant. You'll know from the evidence that those who are sleeping rough, they face complex needs. So that's £58.7 million that's allocated, and the women obviously experience rough sleeping in quite complex ways. They could be fleeing violence, modern slavery. A whole range of factors can drive them into sleeping rough, and I've met women who've been in these sorts of circumstances. So the domestic abuse and safe accommodation grant we provide an uplift of 30 million, brings it to 160 million pounds for 25-26. That's really key. I mean, for many years, many of us have campaigned for more support for women fleeing violence and can end up homeless, and in the worst case scenario in the streets. And I've heard horror stories, absolute horror stories of sexual violence and rape that can then happen when they are in the streets. So those interventions in terms of providing funding and support to local areas, to the partners that the local authorities work with, is key. Then in terms of the inter-ministerial group, of course, we are working closely with other departments. There are programs like the Changing Futures programme, that's a cross-government programme led by MHCLG, which is supported by a number of departments, that has shown really positive results in terms of the support that's provided to those with complex needs, and how what's important is then to look at how we continue those programs. We've put in some additional funding to continue programs like that, and there will be other examples like that as part of the work we do, working with local partners, with charities and other partners, and making sure. The important thing is, if there are good interventions that are effective, what I hope the IMG will do, and I'm keen to do, is identify those and look at how we can encourage local areas to develop those programs, adapt and those innovations that are working, that are adopted. And the funding that we've already provides them flexibility, particularly around the prevention funding, to be able to apply new models, or models that they think are working, they find that are working.
And you spoke about, obviously, the pilots that are currently being undertaken to look at solutions and how to tackle this. And I know that in East Lancashire and Blackburn, they've been piloting sort of pods for rough sleepers, and have had some very, encouraging early responses and evidence of how that is helping to tackle this. What do you think what is your timeline and your time frame for analysing some of these pilots and starting to make sure that those are rolled out more widely and the most effective and impactful options are used more widely?
I mean, we've published the evaluation of the Changing Futures pilot before Christmas, and the results of that pilot is really encouraging. I mean, one of the examples which I often share, is of someone who is receiving support from different agencies over a period of, I think, 13 to 15 years, thousands of interventions, costing something in the order of £1 million to the state. And actually, that's an example of where the cost and the lack of joining up and person-centred, focused interventions mean it's more costly. So those sorts of examples, and the evaluation shows the savings that could be made. If, for instance, one of the key findings is from that evaluation is that having an individual caseworker who helps somebody who's very vulnerable with complex needs navigate through the system, through often a complex web of public services and so on, can dramatically change the outcomes. So I think taking an outcomes-focused, results-focused approach is going to be absolutely critical, because otherwise it takes up a lot of public service in resource, but with suboptimal outcomes, and that's not good enough. And I think in this sphere of complex needs, obviously the health, Department for Health and the relevant health agencies, as well as housing and other relevant departments locally as well as nationally, are key.
And if I might add, one of the things that we've done for 25-26 is to consolidate some of the rough sleeping funding into one overall rough sleeping prevention and recovery grant. And that is designed to give local authorities more flexibility to deliver the services that are needed in their area in which they have proven to work, which the example you mentioned of pods, but there'll be other good areas of good practice throughout the country that we want local authorities to be able to continue.
If I could just ask a quick follow-up question on this, because obviously investing in prevention totally makes sense, but we know historically some councils have spent up to 80% of their rough sleeping money on temporary accommodation just because of the current need. And I believe in this new grant you've indicated 49% needs to be spent on prevention. I did ask this question of the Deputy Prime Minister as well, but have you looked at just the unintended consequences in the short run of whether that can actually mean less money to deal with the emergency for some councils, even while I know we need to invest in prevention for the long term?
The 49% ring fence on prevention is on the homelessness prevention grant rather than on the rough sleeping grants. And I'm sure the Minister will want to answer as well, but the aim there is to start to shift back into prevention first, which we know, which the evidence shows and which experience shows is a much better in terms of the managing the costs of homelessness, but also in terms of the outcomes for individuals.
Yes, I mean, you're alluding to obviously the challenge some authorities are facing, and London councils have contacted me, and I will be meeting with the chair and deputy of London councils, Councillor Holland and Councillor Williams. But just to say, it is really crucial that we do both. We've got to focus on the prevention. Otherwise, we're going to end up where it picks up on the wider points we made earlier. But the other thing is that obviously, in terms of local government settlement, there's a increase in funding to local authorities. It's, I think, in the order of 3.5, just over 3.5% in real terms. And we nationally are working already to support to do what we can to prevent the increase in homelessness. That's why the earlier examples I gave you around the work we've done with the Home Office, for instance, so that the pressures local authorities face are reduced. Likewise, in terms of other work that national government can do to reduce the pressures. For instance, the criminal justice system, those who are leaving, those who are released from prison, if they end up homeless, that then means that in local areas, it can undo the work they're doing. Likewise, in relation to others. Or rough sleeping, indeed, it goes up to rough sleeping.
We just need to wrap up and be quite more succinct in our replies. So
we'll move on now to the issue sometimes of the local authorities and gatekeeping. So just interesting, we've heard again evidence about the impact of this. So I was interested in what steps are you intending to take to discourage local authorities from those gatekeeping practices, and such as using the idea of intentional homelessness to withhold or withdraw support from people who need it?
The intentional homelessness.
So the issue when local authorities will use the idea of of somebody intentionally making themselves homeless in order to prevent them from accessing the support that they need, or withdrawing support that they might otherwise be entitled to.
Well, I mean, as we said earlier, the Code of Guidance is really clear about the legislative framework around intentional homelessness, for example, and it is up to local authorities to make their own judgments on a case-by-case basis about those things. But I mean, there's a legislative framework that is set out in, and
they have particular duties that they need to abide by. Are you referring to stringent or overzealous cases?
Absolutely. And I guess I would ask the question of, do you think people actually intentionally make themselves homeless? The framing of even suggesting that vulnerable people are taking steps to make themselves homeless is quite a challenging sort of statement to make within itself. And it seems to be that there's practice within local authorities whereby they're using the guidance to prioritise and to say this person is less worthy of support than another person. And actually what we hear time and time again is homeless people are coming with really complex trauma background, complex needs, and all need to be treated with respect and all need the support in order to move forward with their lives. So, coming back to the question really, would you be taking steps, or what steps would you take to discourage local authorities from that sort of practice?
Well, I mean, just to reassure you, on where we've seen an issue such as care leavers, for instance, where intentionality has been used in a way that's detrimental. The state, as a corporate parent, has a duty of care to care leavers, and we have worked with the Department for Education and supported them for that amendment, on that amendment. So that's a good example of where, on a case-by-case basis, there are specific injustices and issues that is addressed. In terms of the broader point, there are statutory responsibilities the local authorities have that need to be addressed. In terms of rough sleeping, you're absolutely right. There are complex issues, and that's why getting the right services available and making sure that there aren't unintended consequences in terms of actions that any agency takes, particularly local authorities, but others, that's well understood. And that's where the partnership working, we found, between charities, as well as local organisations, local authorities and regional government as well, is really key.
Yes, I just wanted to come back on the point that was made there, just to unpick that slightly further. So there have been examples, for example, in terms of how this is interpreted, which I appreciate the guidance is set by the department and then it comes down to interpretation. But is there any review of how it is being interpreted across authorities? For example, there are cases where local authorities will say to people, you've got to stay on your property even though you've received an eviction notice until bailiffs knock on the door. Until that point you're not, otherwise you're intentionally homeless, putting people in a really difficult situation, whereas actually the process of supporting them with potentially becoming homeless could start a lot earlier.
I mean, I think that we've all heard stories like that, and sometimes, and I speak as that's more from my experience as a constituency MP, we hear some stories of local council officials, again, being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So what we want to do is make sure that there's staff support. So, for instance, in terms of the way that funding is allocated, providing that flexibility so that councils can get the right support in place, because these are extremely vulnerable people, just as we are doing in terms of employment. Colleagues in DWP looking at how you reform the employment system in terms of job centres and so on. It's really important that the interaction that local authorities and frontline service providers in local agencies, local authorities have, that they get the support they need in order to work sensitively with those who are vulnerable or at risk of homelessness. Because, as MPs, we see that in our surgeries, the trauma that can be been caused to children and families if they are facing homelessness and then being in that situation. So I'm really determined that we, as part of our work on developing the strategy, that frontline workers' voices and experiences and what's going on at that end is fed in, and also we're already feeding in the experiences of members of Parliament, because often members of Parliament and councillors in their surgeries, they're getting those stories and insights that need to be fed in to ensure that there's proper support to those that in those homeless persons units, in those units that are talking to those who are facing homelessness.
Charlotte, Housing First.
Yes, thank you. So moving on to Housing First, which I appreciate you also mentioned at the start when we began this conversation. I appreciate that the department's got a positive evaluation of the Housing First programme. It was just to understand what the plans are to support its wider rollout across England.
Yeah. So the evaluation that was published in October found that the large majority of the Housing First clients were in long-term accommodation a year after entering the programme, and that tenancy is sustainable for 80 to 90%, which is really powerful evidence. So I'm really pleased that, and it's showing that there's good value for money, and we expect the benefits will take the benefits. It will take some time, but we're expecting the amounts to be in terms of savings. Is that correct? Just over 15,000 per person per year. So interventions like that are obviously really encouraging to see. In terms of what happens next, obviously local, there's been funding that was allocated, and for 2025-26 through the 185.6 million through the Rough Sleeping Prevention Recovery Grant. Obviously, in terms of rollout and so on, that's a matter for the spending review. But we're really encouraged by this programme and the data and impact. There will be others like that where, if the evidence base is strong, that's really valuable for us, because then that allows us to look at what we do further to support local areas to develop those initiatives. Not just this one, but others. I mentioned Changing Futures as well.
So obviously this is Housing First has obviously been looked at in other countries as well, and it is seen as a model that works, and as our own pilot has shown, it is showing those positive results, which is great to see. I appreciate what you've said about the spending review, but given that some authorities are already trialling this and using it in certain capacities, is there any conversations at this point happening with local authorities about how they can perhaps bolster that and ensuring that they actually have the resources in place, but also the stock in place to be able to do this in the right way outside of the spending review, because it's actually a solution that could work not quickly, but certainly could get the ball rolling quickly.
Penny you may want to come back to it, but just to say, local authorities now have much more flexibility, in terms of funding. So we hope that they will be able to use that flexibility in a way that they see, to pick up on your point, they see fit.
And local authorities, as well as the Housing First pilots at scale in the 3 regional authorities that government supported over recent years, many other local authorities have been funding Housing First provision through their, what was formerly the Rough Sleeping Initiative, but next year will be the Rough Sleeping Prevention Recovery Grant. So there's and the extra flexibility of the funding next year allows them to carry on doing those things that are working.
Sorry, just ask a follow-up on that. Is there any work happening to ensure that they've got where this is already happening, that they're being allowed to scale that up and that government is providing the support needed in order for them to do this in the right way. Because if we've done the pilot, I just really want to understand how we're going to use that pilot.
Greater Manchester, Liverpool, West Midlands, those are the areas with the Housing First pilots, and obviously it's really valuable to have those pilots and making sure that there is learning. And I've seen already, just on the winter pressures funding, the department held a webinar with 1,000 attendees over a couple of sessions. There's a lot of interest among frontline workers, and obviously those that are leading those pilots. There's again the discussions we have in terms of our expert group. Those are important forums. They have their own as well in terms of sharing good practice, and we want to see more of that.
And just lastly on that, Minister, obviously we talked about the vicious cycle of homelessness. 34% of the individuals who left the programme, again, positive response to the programme, but they cited limited supply of appropriate, affordable properties. So in essence, they could end up back in that cycle of rough sleeping. Is this something that you and colleagues are looking at in terms of the long-term sustainability of affordable properties?
I mean, in terms of the cost of private accommodation is much higher than social housing. Mm-hmm. So the Deputy Prime Minister's determined to make sure that we've got enough, we've got an increase in social and affordable housing, mm-hmm. As we develop as we focus our attention on the house building programme. So it goes back to the point about affordability and supply, which are issues, and again going back to the Renters Reform Bill, mm-hmm. and some of the changes that are being made there.
And the freeze in the LHA rates, which is having an impact on
the Renters Reform Bill and the banning of ending Section 21, which we know from the evidence, I think it's well over 20,000 people who end up homeless because of that particular provision that is going to be ended. So again, taking action to prevent particular policies then having unintended consequences, adverse effects is really important as well.
Thank you. Lewis, moving on to joined up services.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, I want to talk about joined up services. So obviously we've been talking today about very important issues and they're very complex, and some people that are rough sleeping have very complex needs. So how can we, or what's the government doing, in particular your department, around how can we join up those services, in particular with the health service, because that's very important to get around the table, and it's often very challenging to get them around the table. So could you just give us a bit of a flavour around how we're doing that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's why in terms of the national sort of work we do nationally and the strategy, that's why the work we're doing as in the interministerial task force is really key in terms of having those relevant departments and lead the ministers in the interdepartmental group. Secondly, on the funding side, obviously the Department for Health, the investment in the Department for Health over £25 billion. The funding that is being provided on mental health services for opening new health crisis centres. You can imagine people who are at risk of homelessness or off sleeping. There are mental health dimensions to the complex needs that those who are sleeping rough face. Those interventions are really important. I mentioned the drug and alcohol treatment. That's a joint MHCLG Department for Health and Social Care Fund of 58.7 million. There's also the Disabled Facilities Grant, where the Secretary of State for Health announced in January 86 million for the 24-25, and then an additional 86 million investment for 25-26, which brings the total to 711 million. That's really important as well, because we've seen examples of people who are sleeping rough when they need step-down care, to leave hospital, and the arrangements are not appropriate. I've seen firsthand really great examples of the Mildmay Hospital in my own constituency working with the NHS to provide care, but that facility is there. So but in places, in terms of housing, the disabled facilities grant is really important to support those who need that. That's a significant investment. The housing support fund is really key as well, which is obviously not the Department for Health and Social Care. So joined up working is really key. I've given you examples, obviously, on other departments and work we've been doing, education for care leavers, the Home Office I've mentioned. So we're really keen to work in that way. Otherwise, if we've got to look at the needs of the individual affected, whether they are sleeping rough, and how we get them off the streets into the support services that they need in order to make sure there isn't this cycle. And the evidence that we're seeing through some work we're doing with linked data across government, which will be a report which will be published, is really powerful in showing repeat homelessness. So understanding better how to prevent repeat homelessness and rough sleeping, it is rough sleeping focused, is really key again, and departments being able to share data is going to be really key. But that is the approach we're taking, making sure these grants and funds are used appropriately to support the individual thinking about their holistic needs.
So if I can just ask, I'm really conscious of time.
Yep.
So since you've been in post, have you had a meeting then with your counterpart in health and social care where rough sleeping has been on the agenda?
I have had a meeting with my counterpart where homelessness and rough sleeping has been on the agenda. Yep.
Thank you. Just lastly, Minister, you mentioned the linked report on data.
Yep.
Is that something that you're able to share with us as a committee?
Yes, it should be published imminently. Yep.
And just on data, we know that actually the collection of that data is quite patchy. The figures highlighted every year on the number of people sleeping rough is only a snapshot of that. How do you plan to improve on collection and monitoring of the data of people sleeping rough by local authority?
Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so there's two types of collection. There's the annual rough sleeping snapshot, which is really useful as a time series and allows you to see change over time. And that's been collected in that way since 2010. But what we recognised is that gives you a single night snapshot and doesn't capture the complexity and nuance of rough sleeping across the course of a month or across the course of the year. So what we've developed over recent years is the rough sleeping data framework, which is a set of 8 indicators, and they're mapped against the definition of ending rough sleeping, of it being prevented where possible and otherwise rare, brief and non-recurrent. And those indicators then map across the prevention, rare, brief and non-recurrent. And so that allows local authorities to have a much more detailed picture of what is happening in their area, and then they can adapt their services to tackle whatever's going on in their particular place. So actually, if it's a lot of repeat rough sleeping in a particular area, that's a different type of intervention than new flow. So there's two, and we publish that data quarterly as in the interest of transparency, but also local authorities can look at that data, compare it against other local authorities, see what's different in their place or where it's similar to others, and again then collaborate and share good
practice. So just because you do those interim frameworks, is there a permanent move to probably change the annual snapshot if it's so incorrect?
I don't think, I wouldn't characterise it as incorrect, but it is measuring a different thing. It's a single night measure. It is more robustly verified. We have an independent verification by Homeless Link working, so it's a very robust measure, but what it's measuring is a single night snapshot. So I think it is useful. It gives you that time series. You can see change over time. But what the data indicators give you is a richness of monthly data for local authorities that shows you a lot more about the types of rough sleeping in the area. So I think they're useful for different purposes.
Is there any changes to collect demographic information which currently isn't recorded in rough sleepers as part of that estimate?
The annual snapshot collects basic demographic information such as gender and country of origin. But as we talked a little bit about earlier, we do recognise that there is concern among stakeholders that women's rough sleeping is often more hidden for reasons of safety and others. So we're very supportive of the work in the sector to do the women's census and to understand more about that.
And just lastly, obviously a big issue is the number of people leaving who are rough sleeping due to their accommodation and linked to Home Office and asylum refugee accommodation. Is there any plans to incorporate data from the Home Office in that data that you're collecting in that snapshot?
The HCLIC data, which is the homelessness collection, does record people who are homeless on leaving the asylum estate. So that data is collected and published.
And so it's collected as part of rough sleeping?
It's collected as part of the homelessness data, which covers both sort of homelessness, its broadest forms, but there's specific policy as well, which...
Yep. I mean, we are, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have been working immediately straight after the election with the Home Office to provide some time and transition time once status is determined. So if people have refugee status, we've got the spectre of the short period of time, and that's been extended. That's really important in order to help people make that transition in order and get into accommodation and arrange accommodation for themselves. And usually if they have enough time, they can find their way into accommodation, whereas the short period creates more challenges for local areas.
Right, thank you very much for coming this morning, Minister.
Yeah.
We appreciate the responses to questions. I'll bring the meeting to a close. Order.